They left her standing in the mud beside the Platte River with nothing but a flour sack dress and a bruise on her cheek, the color of thunderclouds. Ellie Wren was 11 years old the morning the congregation of New Salem voted to cast her out, and the last words she heard from Reverend Harlan Cobb were ones she would carry in her chest like a stone for the next 7 years. That child is a curse on this town. Her mother died cursed, and the girl carries it in her blood. Let the river have her. But the river did not have her. Not the way Reverend Cobb intended. What nobody in New Salem knew, not the women who turned their faces when she cried, not the men who dragged her mother's body from the church steps and buried it without a marker, was that Ellie's mother had whispered something to her in the dark the night before she died. A name, a place, and a promise that somewhere downstream, carved into a door older than any building in the territory, there were letters that spelled out exactly who Ellie Wren was meant to become. The people of New Salem stopped thinking about her before the first snow fell. They assumed she was dead. They were wrong about that, the same way they were wrong about nearly everything. Ellie did not die that autumn. She crawled into a hollow beneath a cottonwood root and slept curled around her own hunger like a dog around a bone. She ate crab apples until her stomach cramped. She drank from the river and watched the sky for hawks the way her mother had taught her, reading the weather in the angle of their wings. When the first frost came, she walked south along the bank, barefoot, her toes cracking and bleeding on the frozen mud. She was small for 11, thin as a fence rail. Her hair was the color of dirty straw, and she had her mother's gray eyes, the kind that looked silver in certain light. She talked to herself because there was nobody else, and she talked to the river because it was the only thing that moved beside her. 3 days after they cast her out, she found the church. It was not really a church anymore. It sat half-collapsed on a bluff above the river, its roof caved in on the eastern side, its windows empty as eye sockets. The door hung from one hinge. A faded sign nailed above it read, First Mission of the Brethren, 1851, but the date was nearly worn away by wind and rain. Inside, the pews were scattered like broken ribs. Dust and pigeon droppings covered everything. The altar had been stripped, and someone had carved obscene words into the lectern. But Ellie noticed something the vandals had not. The floor behind the altar was warm. She pressed her palm flat against the planks and felt it, a heat rising from below, steady and gentle as breath. She pried up a board with her fingers, splitting 2 nails to the quick, and the smell that rose from the gap was sulfur and mineral and warmth. Steam curled up around her wrist. Below the church, no more than 8 feet down, a hot spring bubbled through a shelf of limestone. The water was not scalding. It was the temperature of a bath drawn by a careful hand. It had been flowing there for centuries, warming the stone, warming the earth, warming the floor of a church that no one had thought to build over a hot spring on purpose. Some frontier preacher had simply wanted level ground and hadn't understood what he'd found. Ellie understood. She pulled more boards. The cavity beneath the church was larger than the building itself, a natural hollow in the limestone where the spring had carved out a space roughly the size of a root cellar, with a sandy floor and walls that radiated warmth. The air down there was humid and smelled of iron and chalk, but it was easily 60 degrees warmer than the October wind screaming across the bluff above. She lowered herself in. The walls were smooth and slightly damp. The ceiling was the underside of the church floor, supported by the original joists, which the hot mineral water had ironically preserved rather than rotted. The constant low heat and the mineral content had petrified the wood, turning soft pine into something nearly as hard as stone. The spring itself pooled in a shallow basin at the far end, overflowing through a crack in the rock and draining somewhere underground toward the river. Ellie sat in that warm darkness and cried for the first time since her mother died. Not from sadness, from relief. She was warm. For the first time in 3 days, she was warm. But warmth alone would not keep her alive, and she knew it. She was 11, not stupid. Her mother, Josephine Wren, had been the daughter of a trapper, and had taught Ellie things that girls in New Salem were not supposed to know. How to read animal tracks. How to identify the 7 plants along the Platte that could be eaten raw in winter. How to estimate temperature? By the speed of cricket chirps, though there were no crickets now. How to bank a fire so it burned all night on a single log. The next morning, Ellie began to build. She started with the church pews. There were 9 of them, made of oak, heavy and solid despite their age. She dragged them one by one to the gap in the floor and lowered them into the cave. Standing on their ends and wedged against the walls, they became partitions, creating separate spaces within the hollow. She filled the gaps between them with river clay, scooping it from the bank and carrying it in her dress, load after load until her arms shook and her back felt like it was made of hot wire. She sealed the floor above her, replacing the boards and packing clay and dead grass around them to create a layer of insulation nearly 4 inches thick. She left 2 openings, one for entry, concealed beneath the collapsed section of roof where no one would think to look, and one for ventilation, a narrow gap at the far end where the steam from the hot spring already rose and dispersed. The natural draft created by the temperature difference between the warm interior and the cold exterior pulled fresh air down through cracks in the walls and pushed stale air up through the vent. She did not know the word convection. She only knew it worked. For food, she did what her mother had taught her. She gathered the last of the autumn cattails from the river shallows, pulling the roots and peeling them to the starchy white core that could be pounded into a crude flour. She found a stand of Jerusalem artichokes on the south side of the bluff, their tubers still firm in the ground, and dug up enough to fill a corner of her cave. She trapped her rabbit using a snare made from a strip of leather she pulled from one of the pew cushions, and she cooked it on a flat stone heated by the spring water, a method so slow it took nearly 4 hours but produced meat so tender it fell apart in her fingers. She discovered that the hot spring water, when channeled into a shallow depression she carved in the sandy floor, stayed warm enough to sprout the cattail seeds she had collected. Within 2 weeks, she had a tiny garden growing in the dim light that filtered through the cracks above, pale green shoots reaching upward like fingers. The first person to find her was a boy named Thomas Lark. Thomas was 13, the son of a mule skinner who had died of cholera the previous spring. He lived in New Salem with an uncle who beat him with a strap every Saturday for sins Thomas could not remember committing. He had been following the river looking for a place to disappear when he smelled sulfur and saw steam rising from the bluff. He found the entrance. He found Ellie. She was sitting cross-legged beside her spring, mending a pew cushion with a bone needle and thread pulled from her own hem. "You're supposed to be dead," Thomas said. "I'm not," Ellie said. He stared at her cave, at the walls lined with dried cattail stalks for additional insulation, at the stone shelf where she had arranged her small supply of food, at the warm pool of mineral water that steamed gently in the half-light. "Can I stay?" he asked. "Can you work?" she said. Thomas could work. He was stronger than Ellie and knew how to use an axe. Over the next 3 weeks before the real cold came, they expanded the cave, digging laterally into the soft limestone, using a broken shovel blade Thomas stole from his uncle's shed. They carved out a second chamber, then a third. They lined the walls with layers of dried grass and clay, creating insulation so effective that even when the temperature outside dropped to 15 below zero, the interior of their cave never fell below 50 degrees, warmed constantly by the geothermal spring beneath them. They built a food storage alcove in the coolest part of the cave, far from the spring, where the temperature held steady at about 40 degrees, a natural root cellar. Ellie packed her Jerusalem artichokes in sand, and they kept for months. She dried strips of rabbit and deer meat over the warm stones, creating a jerky that was tough as boot leather, but rich with protein. When the first blizzard hit in late November, Ellie and Thomas sat in their warm cave and listened to the wind howl above them like a living thing. The church groaned and cracked. Snow piled against the walls, but below the floor, in the earth's own warmth, they were safe. Word reached New Salem that smoke had been seen rising from the old mission church on the bluff. Reverend Cobb dismissed it. "Ghosts," he said from his pulpit, "or Indians. Either way, none of our concern." The woman who brought the news, a laundress named Mrs. Hatch, was not so sure. She had seen small footprints in the snow leading to and from the river, children's footprints. But she said nothing more because Reverend Cobb's word was law in New Salem, and questioning him meant questioning God, and questioning God meant standing in the mud beside the Platte with nothing but a flour sack dress and a bruise on your cheek. By December, Ellie's underground home had grown to 5 chambers. Thomas had found 2 more children, sisters aged 8 and 10, hiding in a barn outside of town after their father had frozen to death on the prairie. Their names were Clara and June, and they arrived shaking and half-starved and were given warm water from the spring and cattail root soup and a place to sleep on a bed of dried grass that smelled sweet and clean. Ellie taught them all what her mother had taught her: how to read the sky, how to identify the plants, how to build a fire that gave heat without smoke by burning completely dry wood in a deep pit, how to purify water by filtering it through layers of sand and charcoal, how to set a bone using splints made from straight sticks and strips of cloth. She taught them without pride, without lecturing, the way you teach someone to breathe. It was simply what you did to stay alive. By January, there were 9 children living beneath the old church. Word had spread among the abandoned and the orphaned and the beaten, the children that frontier towns produced and then forgot about. They came one by one, following the river, following rumors, following the faint smell of sulfur and warmth that rose from the bluff like a promise. Ellie organized them. The older ones hunted and gathered. The younger ones maintained the cave, packing clay into cracks, keeping the ventilation clear, tending the small garden of sprouts that grew in the mineral-rich water. They had rules. Everyone worked. Everyone ate. No one hit anyone. No one was cast down. She was 11 years old, and she had built something that Reverend Cobb, with his church and his congregation and his God of punishment, had never managed to build. She had built a place where people were not afraid. Then the great blizzard of 1863 came, and everything changed. It began on a Tuesday in late February, when the sky turned the color of a dirty nickel and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. The wind came from the northwest at speeds that bent full-grown cottonwoods to the ground. The snow was not snow in any normal sense. It was a wall, a white darkness that erased the world. In New Salem, the blizzard hit with a violence that no one had prepared for. The temperature fell to 37 degrees below zero. The wind drove snows through every crack in every wall. Fireplaces that had kept families warm all winter became useless as the chimneys clogged with ice and the drafts reversed, filling homes with smoke. Livestock froze, standing up in their pens. 3 homes on the east side of town collapsed under the weight of snow on their roofs. Reverend Cobb stood in his church, the grandest building in New Salem, with its pine walls and its glass windows and its cast-iron stove, and watched the stove go cold as the wood supply ran out on the second day. The windows cracked from the temperature differential. Snow poured in. The congregation huddled together in the pews, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, and the temperature inside the church dropped below freezing. Children cried. Old Mrs. Patterson, who was 81 and had survived 2 previous blizzards, said quietly that this one was different. This one meant to kill them all. By the 3rd day, the water supply froze. The well was encased in ice. The river was unreachable through the drifts. People began melting snow over candle flames, producing a few tablespoons of water at a time, barely enough to wet their lips. Meanwhile, beneath the old mission church on the bluff, 7 miles downstream from New Salem, Ellie Wren and her 9 children sat in warmth. The hot spring did not care about the blizzard. It rose from deep in the earth, from places where the temperature never changed, where the rock was heated by forces older than weather, older than winter, older than the concept of cold itself. The water flowed at a steady 104 degrees, filling the cave with humid warmth, condensing on the ceiling and dripping down the walls in a gentle mineral rain. The insulation held. The 4-inch layer of clay and grass between the cave and the church floor above trapped the geothermal heat inside. The children sat in their chambers, warm as biscuits, eating cattail root stew and dried venison, while the worst blizzard in territorial history raged above them like the end of the world. Ellie listened to the wind. She thought about New Salem. She thought about Reverend Cobb's words, "Let the river have her." She thought about Mrs. Hatch, who had seen the footprints but said nothing. She thought about all the people in that town who had watched an 11-year-old girl be dragged to the riverbank and cast out, and had done nothing because doing something was harder than doing nothing. She could let them freeze. Nobody would blame her. Nobody would even know. Thomas watched her face in the firelight. He was 13, almost 14 now, and he had learned to read Ellie the way she read the weather. "You're thinking about going," he said. "They'll die," Ellie said. "They wanted you to die. That's their sin," she said quietly. "Not mine." On the fourth morning of the blizzard, when the wind had dropped just enough to make travel possible, but still dangerous enough to kill anyone who stopped moving, Ellie Wren did something that nobody in the history of that territory had ever done. She dismantled 2 of her church pews, the oak pews she had dragged into the cave and used as walls, and she carried the planks to the river. The Platte was not frozen. Not here. The hot spring fed into it through the underground crack in the limestone, and for a stretch of about 30 yards downstream from the bluff, the water ran warm and open, steaming in the frozen air like a road through the ice. She lashed the pew planks together with strips of leather and cattail rope, building a raft roughly 6 feet by 4 feet. It was crude. It was ugly. It was made from the bones of a house of God. She loaded it with food: dried meat, cattail flour, Jerusalem artichokes, 2 clay pots of hot spring water wrapped in grass to keep them warm, medicine she had made from willow bark and dried yarrow, enough to keep 30 people alive for a week. Thomas and the oldest boy, a 12-year-old named Crow, who never spoke about where he came from, helped her push the raft into the warm stretch of river. The current caught it. The Platte was not a fast river, but it was steady, and it moved north and east toward New Salem with the patient certainty of something that had been flowing since before anyone named it. Ellie climbed onto the raft. "If I'm not back in 3 days," she told Thomas, "you're in charge." She pushed off with a pole made from a broken rafter, and the river carried her. The trip should have been impossible. The temperature was 29 below zero. The wind cut through her clothes like a blade. Ice formed on the edges of the raft and on her eyebrows and on the surface of the clay pots she huddled against. But the river, warmed by the spring, did not freeze beneath her. It carried her through the white darkness of the blizzard, past frozen banks and dead trees sheathed in ice, past the bodies of cattle and deer that had not survived, through a world that had turned to glass and silence. She reached New Salem in 6 hours. The town was barely visible. The buildings were buried to their roof lines. Smoke rose from nothing. The streets were canyons of snow. Ellie tied her raft to the bridge piling and climbed up through a drift that was taller than she was, pulling herself upward with her bare hands until she reached the main street. She found them in the church, 43 people packed together, blue-lipped and shaking, their breath crystallizing in the air. Reverend Cobb sat in the front pew with his Bible open on his lap, but his eyes were closed and his skin was the color of candle wax. 3 children had stopped crying. They were too cold to cry. Mrs. Hatch saw her first. The old laundress was huddled near the dead stove, wrapped in a horse blanket, and when the door opened and the small figure walked in carrying a steaming clay pot, she thought she was hallucinating. Then she smelled the willow bark tea and the dried venison and the mineral tang of hot spring water, and she began to weep. "Lord in heaven," Mrs. Hatch whispered, "it's the Wren girl." Ellie set the pot on the stove. She opened her pack. She moved through the church like someone who had done this before, like someone who had been preparing for this moment without knowing it, distributing food and warm water and medicine with the quiet efficiency of a woman 4 times her age. Reverend Cobb opened his eyes. He stared at her. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His fingers, black with the first stages of frostbite, trembled on the pages of his Bible. "Drink this," Ellie said, and held the cup to his mouth. He drank. He did not say thank you. He did not say anything. But something behind his eyes broke like ice in spring, and tears ran down his waxy cheeks and froze in his beard. Over the next 2 days, Ellie made 3 more trips on her church pew raft, ferrying supplies from the cave to New Salem. Thomas and Crow helped, loading the raft, keeping the warm stretch of river clear of ice. They brought more food, more medicine, hot stones wrapped in wet grass that radiated heat for hours. They brought instructions, written in Ellie's careful hand on scraps of pew cushion fabric, for how to build insulated shelters from snow and debris, how to melt ice efficiently using body heat and reflection, how to treat frostbite with gradual warming rather than direct heat, which would cause the flesh to die. When the blizzard finally broke on the 7th day and the sun came out over a world encased in ice, 17 people from New Salem followed Ellie Wren south along the river to the bluff. They walked in silence. Their homes were destroyed. Their livestock was dead. Their food stores were buried or ruined. They found the old mission church, half collapsed, snow piled against its walls. They looked at it and saw nothing. A ruin. A skeleton. Then Ellie lifted the concealed entrance and warm air rose from below, and they descended into the earth and found the cave that 9 abandoned children had turned into a home. The hot spring, the insulated walls, the garden of pale green shoots growing in mineral water, the food stores, the beds of dried grass, the 5 warm chambers carved from living rock. They found a door. It was at the back of the deepest chamber, set into the limestone wall, a door that Ellie had discovered in December when she had been digging to expand the cave. It was old, far older than the church above, made of petrified wood, dark as iron, with hand-forged hinges that had turned green with age, and carved into its surface, in letters that had been cut deep enough to survive a century of mineral deposits and moisture, was a name. Wren, not Ellie Wren, just Wren. The same word, the same letters, carved by a hand that had been dead for longer than anyone could guess. Ellie's mother had known. Josephine Wren had whispered it in the dark. Find the door with our name on it. She had known about the spring, about the cave, about the old mission church. She had known because her own mother had told her, and her mother before that. The Wrens had been coming to this place for generations, long before any church was built above it, long before any town called New Salem existed. They had been the first to find the spring, the first to shelter in the earth's warmth, the first to understand that the land itself could keep you alive if you listened to it. Behind the door was a chamber that Ellie had not yet opened, sealed shut by mineral deposits. But the name was enough. The name was everything. Reverend Cobb stood in the warm cave, surrounded by the children he had cast out and the knowledge they had gathered. And he understood for the first time in his life that he had been building his church on the wrong foundation. He had built it on authority, on fear, on the power to cast out. Ellie had built hers on warmth, on the willingness to let people in. He removed his hat. He was an old man, older than his years, broken by the blizzard in ways that went deeper than frostbite. I owe you a debt, he said. I owe you more than that. You don't owe me anything, Ellie said. She was stirring a pot of cattail soup. She did not look up. But if you want to help Mrs. Patterson needs her feet looked at, and the Granger baby hasn't eaten in 2 days. The people of New Salem stayed in a cave for 3 weeks while the worst of the winter passed. They slept in the chambers that children had carved. They ate the food that children had gathered. They drank water that had been rising from the earth since before any of them were born. And they learned. Ellie taught them the way her mother had taught her. How to read the land. How to use what the earth offered without taking more than it could give. How to build walls from clay and grass. How to preserve food in sand. How to let the ground itself keep you warm when the sky was trying to kill you. She taught them without anger, without satisfaction, without the need to say, I told you so. She taught them because teaching was what you did when you knew something and someone else needed to know it. When spring came and the snow melted and the prairie turned green, the people of New Salem did not go back to their old town. Not all of them. Some did, the ones who could not accept that an 11-year-old girl had saved their lives. But most stayed. They built new homes on the bluff, above the cave, using the techniques Ellie had taught them. Thick walls of sod and clay, insulated roofs, root cellars dug into the limestone, where the temperature never changed. They built around the hot spring, channeling its water for cooking and cleaning and heating, creating a settlement that was warmer in winter and cooler in summer than any wooden town on the plains. They called it Wren's Landing. Mrs. Hatch, who had seen the footprints in the snow and said nothing, became the first person to publicly apologize. She did it on a Sunday morning, standing in the open air where the church had been, with no pulpit and no roof and no authority except her own shame. "I saw," she said, "and I did nothing. That is a sin I will carry the rest of my days. But I will spend those days earning the right to live in a place built by better hands than mine." Others followed. Not all, but enough. Reverend Cobb did not apologize in words. He apologized in action. He spent the rest of that spring carrying stones for the new settlement, building walls alongside children he had once condemned. His hands, damaged by frostbite, healed slowly. 2 fingers on his left hand never regained feeling. He said it was a fair price. On the day the last home was finished, Ellie walked down to the river. She was 12 now, tall for her age, her gray eyes steady as the water. Thomas stood beside her, whittling a piece of cottonwood. "What will you do with the door?" he asked. "The one with your name." "Open it," she said. "When I'm ready." "What do you think is behind it?" Ellie watched the river. The Platte moved the way it always had, patient and certain, carrying whatever was placed upon it to wherever it needed to go. "Doesn't matter," she said. "Whatever's behind it, my mother wanted me to find it. And my grandmother before her, and her mother before that. It's not about what's behind the door. It's about knowing the door is there. Knowing someone put your name on it. Knowing you belong somewhere, even when the whole world tells you that you don't." Thomas nodded. He did not fully understand, but he understood enough. The sun set over Wren's Landing, and the hot spring sent its steam into the evening air, and the children who had been cast out sat on the bluff above the river and watched the light go gold and then amber and then the deep bruised purple of a prairie sky at dusk. Ellie Wren had been abandoned at 11, with nothing but a flour sack dress and a bruise on her cheek. She had built a raft from church pews, and the river had carried it to a town full of people who needed saving. She had found a door with her name on it, carved by hands she would never know, in a cave warmed by the same earth that had warmed her ancestors. And the people who had told her the river would have her were right, in a way they never intended. The river did have her. It carried her exactly where she was meant to go. Years later, when Wren's Landing had grown into a proper town, with a school and a trading post and homes that stayed warm through the worst winters the territory could offer, visitors would sometimes ask about the name. About the old petrified door in the cave beneath the bluff. About the girl who'd built a settlement from nothing at the age of 11. The old-timers would smile, and they would say what Ellie herself had said, the words she spoke so quietly that only those closest to her ever heard them, the words she had carried from her mother and would carry to her grave. The earth doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, loved or hated, old or young. It only asks one thing. Are you willing to listen? Because if you listen, it will tell you everything you need to know. Where to find water, where to find warmth, where to find shelter. The earth has been keeping people alive since before people had names. All you have to do is stop talking long enough to hear it. The door with her name on it was never opened in Ellie's lifetime. She said she was saving it. For what, she never said. But on cold nights, when the wind howled above the bluff and the hot spring sent its warmth up through the stone, she would press her palm against those ancient carved letters and close her eyes, and she would feel the heat of the earth rising through the wood, steady and patient as a heartbeat. And she would know she was home.